Welcome. I'm Maureen Wright. I'm the stated clerk in the Presbytery of West Virginia. And those who have been working to plan this event hope that this now virtual gathering models one way in which committees on ministry and committees on preparation for ministry can pivot to offer quality meetings and events. We're thankful to have Leslie Mott with us today. Leslie is a minister of Word and Sacrament in Hudson River Presbytery. She has served as the coordinator of Pastoral Sabbath at Holmes Camp and Stony Point Center. She is currently ministering as coordinator for spirituality and practice in Bedford, New York. As Mike said earlier, if you have questions, please remember to type them into the chat box. Let's open with prayer. Let us pray. O Lord, we come to you from the constant stream of news, weary from the noise of pandemic, from the worry, anxiety, and for some depression, from the sequestered and quarantined, withdrawn and even hiding. Wash over us like the rocks of a mountain stream, like the flow of a mighty river, like the waves of an ocean. Fill us, Lord, with your comfort and hope, with your peace, with assurance that you are our God. Prepare us in this moment for the work before us, that we may listen and fill our cups to overflowing with renewed energy for the work of committees on ministry and committees on preparation for ministry. May we be the leaders that you need for your church in this time, for your glory. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Leslie, welcome.
Thank you. I am glad to be here with you. I just wanted to update you. Perhaps that bio was a little bit old. I have been in interim ministry for the last 2 years, so I sort of live in transition. I've been interim and transitional pastor at a couple of different congregations, and now I am a part-time interim at a UCC church in Middletown in Orange County. So at large in Hudson River and ministering in interim ministry. So I wanted to begin. I have a couple of frameworks for us, and I will share the screen for our discussion piece with the document I have, and I'll also email that to whoever I get the email address from. So I wanted to just start with the this current situation, and that we find ourselves in this part. It's the conversations, I think, about full or part-time ministry are going to happen sooner rather than later, perhaps, as we are looking at ways of doing ministry, and I think they might be happening more willingly or perhaps unwillingly than ever before. So my process, which was several years ago, might necessarily be different or need some adaptation for these times, because we are in an unprecedented time. That said, I wanted to ask you about the questions that you bring to this discussion. What is the primary thing that you want to know or need to know? And that if you could type them into the chat, I'll make sure that we can circle back around and come back to them in the course of our discussion. But I didn't want to sort of leave anything hanging. So if you go ahead and type your pressing, maybe just your pressing question into the chat, and we can see those, we can see and share those. And then I'll start with some background information and how it was. So I'm going to screen share with you. So we'll have a chat open, we'll have this open, and then I'm going to share my process with you. Let's see. Here it is. So can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I'm sorry, let me come back and make my bigger here. Great, okay. So I just wanted to start by saying that my process with my congregation was a year-long process. So this is not a short duration. It took a lot of time to get people on board because I introduced it. I was the pastor of the church, and my background is that I had been there for 9 years full-time. And like many of you, I had sat in session meeting after session meeting with the concerns of the finances and the budget over and over again. Are we going to yoke? Are we going to close? Are we going to move? I mean, and the elephant in the room seemed to be the part-time pastorate. This church had an endowment and still does to this day. And there had been some sort of magical thinking around that endowment and what a balanced budget actually meant. It took me about 5 years of my pastorate there to get them to say deficit budget, and because there was an old model of moving a chunk over and going, ta-da, our budget is balanced, and so just to actually say deficit budget was a huge hurdle, and then to sort of be kicking the can down the road almost at every session meeting about, well, we have enough for the next, year. And so this conversation had, maybe with, like many of you, had been happening for a long time about the viability and the feasibility of the church, but not specifically around a part-time pastorate. Mostly it's centered around, we need more members, we need more, we need to do all the things that we need to do to get the increased membership and increased money. So that being said, I introduced a process of discernment. And so my process was to introduce a Bible study in the beginning of each session meeting that focused, and you can pick any story that you like. There's plenty about discernment and about calling and about vocation. And so we had a Bible study at the beginning of every session meeting, and there was a lot of pushback about that as well. And then ending with 3 concrete steps to move forward. And they were simple steps, like could we have an additional time after church for people to express their concerns? My experience has been in a lot of presbyteries, in my presbytery, that there's lots of programs for church regeneration, but they sort of have this model that you get the session on board, and then the session gets on board, and then the session, along with the participation of the congregation, turns the ship around, right? And our process was substantially different in that we started from the bottom up as well as top down. So I had to get the session on board by this Bible study and the process of discernment, and what are we called to do? If anything were possible, what were we called to do? And not thinking that we knew all of the answers, but also to go from the bottom up. One of the first concrete steps that we took was to have the session go into the library after worship and be available for questions or comments, fears, like ideas from the congregation. And the session's job was to simply listen, which is hard for sessions to do sometimes because we want to act immediately. And so that was a little difficult. But we found, and they were just to listen and take notes and to bring that back to the session and the next meeting. And so there was resistance a lot about the time that it was going to take for the 20 minutes or maybe 30 minutes of each session meeting doing this discernment process. Because we have too much work to do, we've got an agenda, we're never going to get it, And I'm sure if you've tried to do something along those lines, you've experienced that resistance. And I'm not saying that it's not legitimate or not full of concern for the work that needs to be accomplished in those meetings. But we found that after 20 or 30 minutes of this discernment work and prayer and Bible study, that we were much more efficient with our time, that we still managed to keep our session meetings to just over or under 2 hours, which was a very different result than what I expected. And so that was, it was a wonderful thing to see. And then one session meeting, there was one person who sort of the light bulb went on and said, oh, okay, I see where you're going. And the next session meeting, maybe another person, but it took 6 months for the session to get fully on board with the process. So just expect resistance. And in our conversations and putting down concrete results, or inviting ourselves to think of ways to move forward, even small steps. There was a lot of talk about, this is going to be a lot more work than we expected. This is going to be a lot more work than we want to do. And I said, you're absolutely right. I think that's true. So the results were slow. It took about 6 months for the session to sort of see where discernment and concrete steps and change might begin to happen within the session itself and within the congregation. But also at the same time, what began to happen from those listening conversations, and one of my operating questions was, what would you do if you had an interim pastor? If this were an interim time, now I'm not going anywhere, but if we had to treat this as an interim time, what would we do? And somebody said, oh, that was so much work. We had to do small groups, and we had to do our mission study, and I said, right. What if we treated this time of transition as an interim time where we ask those questions again of ourselves? And so out of that, so that small groups started. They started having dinners. They started having not only the listening sessions after worship, but small group gatherings in people's homes about the concrete steps that we could take. There was a lot of listening. We tried to have session members be the only person, and then the rest be congregational members. And people began to get excited. A youth group, which I had done confirmation, of course, and some youth activities, and particularly around mission and habitat, but somebody else volunteered to do youth work out of this. And so we started to see some energy around mission, some energy around, and so small things started to pop up. And people got excited because there was a lot of energy around, because the session was more invested, the congregation was more invested, and they immediately said, this is great. Now let's take all of this and use it and go back. And go back to how we used to do things. We just have this new energy. So I would say number 5, expect miracles, and then a desire to return to the old model. So we can be in a new process and looking at church a new way, about a shared ministry, and then immediately have the desire to take whatever we've learned and apply it to the way it used to be. So that is a really real desire, because it's a comfort zone. I'm gonna just stop, and there's a question about afford to live on a part-time salary and benefits. I'll address that from my own experience, and then feel failure if they must move to part-time. Okay, so I just wanted to pause there for a moment and make sure that I'm sort of going through this pretty quickly because I'd like time for discussion. I have found moving through that the process for this involved my own pastoral discernment as well as congregational discernment, so that they were parallel but not congruent, or vice versa, maybe congruent but not parallel. I, at the time, had also been exploring my desire to minister to clergy. I became a yoga teacher during my tenure there. I became a spiritual director. I became a focusing practitioner. I was exploring ways that my ministry was expanding. And I wanted to do that in service to the church and to the congregation. For example, some of my congregants came to my yoga classes and people wanted to do spiritual direction. But I was also doing this for my own sense of vocation and how that was changing, which I think is a crucial question for clergy to continually ask themselves. Am I called to this place in this time, and in what way? And am I still called to this place in this time, and in what way? Because we tend to get caught up in the life of the congregation, and we are working for the future of this particular part of the church. And sometimes we don't pay attention to the deep yearnings of our hearts in our own vocation, whether that is parallel or congruent with the congregation's path as well. So I'm going to address this question: how can we find good quality pastoral leadership? So the pastoral considerations, number 7 on my list, especially financial and time commitment. When we reached the end of the year of discernment, we started in June and went through the next June. And the session was so excited about the energy, the increased mission, the giving, the change that they said, we're so excited. Now we know we can keep you full time. And now we know that this is where we need to be. And at the same time, I had been discerning, and my discernment was that it was time for me to move to a part-time position in this congregation so that I could still begin to explore my vocation, which was, and they don't exist anymore, but pastor to pastors, because I really felt the deep need. And I started the pastoral Sabbath, and I began this work, and I was able to do that. And here's the question: I was able to do that. My grandmother had left me a bequest which could take me through the next year, and so I was able to live on the part-time salary because I had, and in my own prayer, I thought my Nana, who was a lifelong Presbyterian and church elder, was with me, and so that's what I did, and I actually stayed a little longer than that, but I found that, and this will go into my biggest mistakes too, that I found that staying with the same congregation in a part-time position was very difficult because I had been there full-time for 9 years. And so even though we worked out, I was there, I went to a 3/5 model, which meant that I would be there 4 Sundays out of 5, preach 3 Sundays. The 4th Sunday, I would be not present in the pulpit. I would not be in church. I thought it was extremely important for a part-time pastorate to see that their pastor was part-time. And the way the congregation sees that is that they don't have a pastor in the pulpit full time. And there was lots of pushback about that too. Why can't you just work less during the week and be here every Sunday? I was pretty strongly adamant about that a part-time pastorate needs a part-time pulpit. And so that meant that the session had to preach, and they had to get guest preachers. And we found preaching resources from our congregation that we never even dreamed, that we had fine preachers, and people shared poetry, or they did music, and then if there was a 5th Sunday, then I did a dialogue sermon, so that I would introduce a question or of spiritual practice. I'm a teacher of meditation and spiritual practices, so I would introduce that, and we would have that be the sermon portion of our worship. So that was a crucial part. So getting back into my biggest mistake was that I thought that I could transition seamlessly from a full-time for a part-time pastorate, and yet I found myself increasingly pulled toward full-time duties because the pastoral care didn't really change. people still needed visitation and phone calls and hospital visits. And even though I'd stopped doing aspects of my job, like the jazz vespers on Saturday night once a month, I stopped that. They had found somebody else to lead that. And I wrote, and it was more work for me. I had to write the whole model of worship, right? And for worship leadership, I had to write the whole script for guest preachers and such, and because they had to learn how to lead worship in my absence. So initially, it was a lot more work for me to guide them into these leadership roles. And so my mistake was, I think, staying a little bit too long in the part-time role, because people got accustomed to paying the part-time salary and having a full-time pastor. I learned that the hard way when I ran out of money and then could no longer afford to stay there. And then, but what happened was, and I'll get to that, the good stuff. What had happened, why I stayed so long, was that we had a balanced budget. Our mission giving was out of this world. Our participation was amazing. We started a capital campaign that was fully funded through 2 phases. The shared ministry, I wanted to get the good stuff as well. They finally painted the bathrooms. We had a new roof and new boilers and new floors and new plaster. I mean, it was an amazing transformation for the church. And selfishly, I wanted to see it. I wanted to see it. And so I probably stayed a little too long, although God is so amazing in the way that God works. I had been questioning my own, why hadn't I left? Why did I not leave? Why when I had a little bit of a buffer, why didn't I change? And then we had a beloved member and a crucial, and Rhonda knew him, Norm Brown, and Dave Mason, you know him too. Norm Brown was a member of a staunch ally, a wonderful man. His wife was, and perhaps still is, the clerk of session at that church. He was stricken with a very sudden illness. He had babesiosa, and over the course of a matter of weeks, sickened, was in ICU, and died in the hospital. It was an incredible shock to me personally, to our congregation. It was a devastating blow. But in that moment, I said, oh, that's why I'm here. I'm supposed to be here for this. I knew immediately, it was so clear that I was supposed to be here for this time, to bring them through Norm's passing and his death and his funeral. He had full military honors at West Point. We had 2 funerals. One was 500 people in a neighboring church, and another one at West Point. And it was another 6 months before I was able to bring them through that pastoral care, before I was able to let them know that I was going to leave. And that was a huge blow for them. So I'm going to stop there. And just bring us back. Can I take this down so I can see all of you? And I'll, if that's helpful, I can email that back to you. And then I want to address comments and questions. First of all, just comments about that process. Mike, if you want to raise your hand or unmute, I don't know, Mike, how you want to kind of do that.
What would you like for me to do?
If we could raise hands, if you have immediate comments or questions about
Oh, okay.
that. And if you could,
I'll take you off
okay.
the
Oh, yes.
spotlight.
Review, please. Yeah, thanks.
So if you go upper right, you should be able to click on gallery view to see everybody.
Okay, so I've got the gallery view. Are you seeing hands or?
Leslie, this is Sue. You have questions in the chat that have been up there, and I think you should go through maybe we have asked people to go through the chat.
Great.
So maybe scan that, or Mike can heads up them to you, which might be easier for you.
So, so I'm going to start with Joy, with Jay Kopman. How do we find good quality pastoral leadership who can afford to live on a part-time salary and benefits? I find that advertising a call as part-time cuts the applicants to 10% of those who would apply for full-time positions, and indeed that is true. There has been, in my experience, a lot of lip service in presbyteries and synods about bivocational ministry, but pastors are sort of on their own, right? We want to, yes, all this church can afford is full-time, but it doesn't. I haven't found a lot of ways that presbyteries or a lot of support for pastors who are trying to do that. If they're a clergy couple, maybe they can live on a salary, maybe they can have another job, but for clergy to live on a part-time salary it's not possible. It's not physically possible. So the congregation needs to also know that the clergy will have another job. We'll simply have to have another job. And that's, and maybe we need to put that in our job descriptions. And about the church, they say, this is part-time, but here's what's available in our area, or we welcome people who have other vocations. If you are a teacher, or if we are, this sort of opens up the field of pastoral ministry, but that's my immediate sort of response to that, because clergy, we haven't ever asked them to be bivocational or to think about that, but this is the time. This is the necessary time. Joy, did you want to say anything about that?
Yes, for those of us who live and serve in Appalachia, this has been our reality for a long time. Far fewer than even half of our pastors are full-time currently. And so we find all kinds of ways to fill pulpits and pastoral positions with good quality people. Some are commissioned lay pastors, some are retired pastors, seminary trained, both from our tradition and from other traditions. Some are full communion partners, some are not. We have a Church of the Brethren pastor part-time. We have a Lutheran pastor part-time. We've had UCC, we've had Methodist. But I think that expectations need to change among two cohorts, people in the pews, and you've been very helpful in explaining a process that was more or less good and whole for members of a congregation discerning what part-time ministry might look like faithfully and joyfully. I believe the other cohort that needs to change its expectations are those of us who are pastors who have gone to seminary. For those of us in the baby boom and younger, we have all been trained up with the expectation that we would earn our full-time living as pastors. I believe that that is no longer a valid expectation, at least not in the traditional church, and it's beginning to appear to me also not in the next church, whatever that morphs into. So I think we're looking at more and more tent making, and those of us who are pastors have got to get used to that idea. Certainly for those of us in Appalachia, in many ways we are still a colonial kind of culture where the circuit rider would come through once every 6 months and baptize the babies and officiate at marriages, sometimes before, sometimes after the babies were born, and officiate at the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. I see us going back to that understanding. I believe that implies partnership with seminaries. And just as there is resistance in pews to leaving off the notion of full-time pastors just serving us in our church, I think there is a little bit of pushback in some seminaries about this reality. Like you said, there's lip service paid, but how do we actually train people for pastoral ministry with a deep and solid expectation that they will not be earning their living doing pastoral ministry? And I know you as an individual may or may not have had experience with that.
Yeah. Well, my mother is a retired Presbyterian minister. And so was very traditional in her, I mean, she graduated seminary in 1976. So she was sort of the second wave, but started off as an associate with a senior male minister, did all the stuff, and then became part of an interfaith part of it was Disciples of Christ, Methodist, Presbyterian, and UCC, multi-denominational campus down in Virginia. And so that was shared ministry, but she did, and she was at some Princeton Seminary as professional studies director. And so she had this, but she had always earned her living full time in ministry. And it was part of the reason I didn't go to seminary till I was in my 30s. I thought, no, I'm not having any of that. But I agree that the expectations are crucial. The expectations of ourselves, the expectations of seminaries, expectations of presbyteries, because what we have grown up with is our full-time pastors. We have all grown up with our full-time pastors. And this is a huge shift in the way we think about how we do church and how we do ministry. Thank you. I guess this is from you, Sue, when it's how do we help pastors in place, often heading towards retirement, to take on this kind of vocational tweak in their congregation? Some might see the pending move to part-time as failure on that part. And if it's possible, it would be helpful. Oh, let's see. Okay, so I would sort of, so this again speaks to expectations. How would a move, if you were a pastor, how would a move for you if you're heading toward retirement, and a move to part-time, if you could afford to do that, and if the congregation is discerning that as well, what would that mean for you personally? What would it mean for you in terms of professional assessment, in terms of personal assessment about your ministry? I mean, sort of you have this whole arc of ministry, and then, oh, does it just fizzle out? I mean, what are your experiences of how would that feel? Just trying it on mentally. Yes.
In our presbytery, we have tried that on. We are in the midst of it with the position that I occupy. For 4 years, I helped each year a church, in addition to being part-time general presbyter. And while there were some weeks, like Holy Week, that were just crazy, and there's no way that I was part-time at either place at that point. Most weeks, if I exercised enough inner discipline, it worked quite well. And the congregations then paid the presbytery for my time so that the presbytery could keep my salary and benefits package full-time. This is the year that the position I occupy is to go to 2/3 time without any additional work with congregations in interim or transitional periods. It was working quite well until the pandemic occurred. And now I'm working just as hard as ever. I'm trying to get information to all of our churches, cajoling churches to close when they needed to close to keep everybody safe. Now we're starting the rollout of how do we decide when and how to reopen ourselves. I know there are some others on this call who are also living in part-time calls, and maybe they would like to share what it's been like in their places.
Yeah, and especially if you know that you are going to be the last full-time pastor and that the next pastor they call will be part-time, how do you help transition a congregation if you're not going to be the one that's going to be leading them in that congregation? How do we help set up those folks?
So I'm going to try to moderate this a little bit with you. I think it'll be easier for you. I know we have some folks in the chat that are addressing this.
Okay.
One of the things, Carol, if you could briefly, you went part-time before you retired, and it was the way you began with the conversation. Can you briefly maybe share that? And if Leslie, if there's a reflection, go ahead. Yeah, Mike, you can undo the unmuting there. I don't-
I unmuted, I got it.
Oh, it's you. Of
Yeah,
course
it's
you got it
me.
yourself. You
I'm learning the Zoom
doing
stuff.
good, Carol.
But anyway, when I first came to Stroudsburg, I responded to an ad for a part-time pastor. I was in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky and had irritated the wrong people and needed to get out. And so I took the first thing that I thought I could live with, which was in 1983. The church was offering me a 12-hour-a-week position at $5,000 a year. And I said, God, I think this is the right place, the right time. And so off I went. And for 3 years, I worked part-time, doing a multiple of different things, driving taxi cab, inserting newspapers, working at a ski resort. And I finally ended up with the Girl Scouts at a full-time position with them and part-time at the church. And then the church got a $500,000 endowment. And with that, they chose to bring me on full-time and do some other mission ministry with the proceeds of that. When I looked at retirement, because I stayed at the same church I was an associate pastor there for 29 years. When I looked to retirement, I thought, I've seen people that have tried to retire and don't do that very well. And so my parents were at a place in their life where they were needing some more care. My sister was providing care, but she needed respite. And so I'm thinking, how can I finish ministry here? Because I didn't feel a call to move elsewhere. And I pursued that several times in that 29 years, and nothing ever convinced me I needed to move on. So I went to the session and said, I would like to go to 3/4 time. And this is what I would like the 3/4 time to look like. And what I said was, I want 1 week off every month, including Sundays. And so we did that for, I think, at least 3 years. And so I and it was a combination of things, because the church was struggling membership-wise and financially, and I could see they were not going to be able to have a full-time associate anymore. And so I was trying to get out before it became critical. But it also met my needs to help my sister in caring for our parents. And so it was hard to back off, because the first time I had other work that I was doing. The second time, it was my call as to when I said no. And, if I was going to be not working for a week, I wasn't going to work for a week.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. It takes a lot of strength to simply hold your own ground, doesn't it?
It does.
It sure does. There's been some comments in the question in the chat about how do you speak. Rebecca says, how do you speak, to the little ladies who just don't get it, right? That for the most part, most people will. There's always going to be some who are saying, I want to, and I had that too. I had somebody who I did her father's funeral, and she said, we need you full time. There was no other discussion. How I framed my response to her was that I have a call. I framed it in terms of call, which is how I said I have to pay attention to the needs of the congregation and what I think God is calling you to do, but I also have to pay attention to what God is calling me to do. And that, I don't know if that's helpful or not. Rebecca, do you want to say anything about your conversations?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I was getting coffee. That's why I muted my video. So I'm in kind of a unique situation where I have two part-time churches, and in the city that I live in, they're about 30 minutes apart, which so like doing a lot of things together is not really possible because of where they're located geographically. Before COVID-19, I found that my biggest struggle was communicating to people that, I know that in the past you may have had, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and 2 Easter services. But if I multiply that by 2, that's no one human being can do that. And I found for the most part that my leaders have understood that and they get it. But it's my, who I lovingly call my little old ladies sitting in the pews, who are like, but this is the way we've always done it. In a lot of ways, I find this COVID-19 to be a great blessing for the church, because the things I've been saying for years are now coming to a head. We now have one Zoom worship service on Sunday morning, and everyone is unhappy because I had to take 2 very different liturgies and write one liturgy. We are trying to have a virtual council meetings and session meetings, but one church doesn't want to do that, and I have to be respectful of that. So yeah, it's just a lot of what I do is reminding people of how the expectations have changed and being firm, I guess, in that. So I actually preach twice on Sunday, once we're back to the new normal or whatever that looks like. And it's really interesting because I think people only see what they're a part of. So like frequently I'll get to the second church and I'll be upset about something that happened at the first church, and people will be like, why are you tired? We just got here. I'm like, well, my day started at 7 and it's now 12. So yeah, just like managing expectations and helping people see that this is different. I'm not just the budget solution, has been key. But next time I get into this conversation, I think it would be helpful to talk about it in terms of call. Now, funerals, that's not the time to be having the conversation about call. But so I did have one instance a couple months ago where I had a funeral at one church and the craft show at the other church on the same day. And of course, the church with the craft show was upset that I wasn't there the whole time shaking hands with people. And of course, the church with the funeral was upset that I wasn't there an hour early and I couldn't stay an hour after. So we had a really interesting conversation about how like funerals have to trump fun things that we're doing in the community, and here's why. But on the other hand, funerals aren't happening every day and every week. And just because I couldn't make this one craft show doesn't mean that I don't love you. And I don't think spending time together is important. Anyway, welcome to my TED Talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Bob Saul wrote in the chat that he has been bivocational for 35 years, full-time funeral service and part-time pastoral ministry. Bob, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything more about that. I really appreciate that comment. And there's some great resources. Rhonda Cruzy had put, and I haven't seen this book yet, a newly published book. So we can print the chat or email the chat so that everybody can have these resources.
Yep.
So there she is. She's holding it up. Part-time is plenty. Love it. Thriving without full-time clergy. So that looks like a great resource. And there's also what Aaron put up, an instruments seems like a great way to manage expectations. The pastor part-time expectation worksheet, and then a project sheet, which seems to be a wonderful resource as well. I don't know if you are able to share those, Aaron, with folks. Where did Aaron go?
Hi, Leslie. I will put the links for our pastor expectation timesheet. We actually use this for the startup of all of our first call pastors and all of our part-time pastors. We require it. and we recommend it for every pastoral startup. We also recommend revisiting it periodically, in particular when tensions start to emerge. One of the things that happened in one of our churches, which was about a 3/4 time call, was we had the deacons and the session individually go through and fill out this worksheet in terms of how much time they thought should be allocated for all the various duties of a pastor. They were convinced that the pastor was underperforming, but when we compiled the worksheet, it came out to a 137-hour work week. But when the pastor started to keep honest time of his call, he discovered that actually he was underperforming by about 5 hours a week and was overestimating the amount of time he was putting in. And when he kept an honest timesheet, it turned out to be less than he thought. He had a toddler and a lot of other things going on in life. So I'll put, I think I see that Michael's put up the pastor time expectation sheet. Michael, I think we also have a sample up of our smart sheet of the weekly project management sheet. And maybe if you don't mind, you could put that up. So we have found that these kind of honest talks, in particular when there's some sense of humor. I posted in the chat that we had one pastor, a new pastor starting a part-time call, who said that she could not produce a sermon in less than 16 hours a week. And the church told her that they would be very happy with her 8-hour-a-week sermon. And I think they have helped her to relax a bit and not expect perfection. And she has helped them understand the importance of rigorous research to her. And they're bumping along, but I think they're all growing from the journey together.
Hey, Leslie, before you continue the conversation with, I'm sorry, I know I'm butting in, your mouth was opening, but before you continue, we maybe look a little bit more pointedly at judicatory places in this conversation. Mm-hmm. There's two comments that haven't been picked up on that I think may work together. So you get a twofer here.
Good.
Steve Fritz raised way back when, was there a point at which the pastor session and congregation struggled with who was driving this need to move to part-time? Were there ever accusations that you were doing this to us? And because in my brain, this makes sense, maybe you'll be able to connect this as well. Redstone recently just posted, and I'm assuming that maybe Skip, that part of what their conversation is in Redstone with folks is that it's not just a money thing about the pastor, but sometimes moving to part-time permits them to invest more money. How will that invest more money in mission and ministry? To me, those two might connect. I hope your brain might see that as a possibility.
Yeah, I think it does. First of all, to address the first one, you're doing this to us. By the time we reached the end of that year, and they saw the difference and then said, well, let's go back because now we can do it. I said, but why do you think it's happening? Why do you think the results are the results that you're getting? And they're sort of like, oh, right. It's because we were doing all this new stuff, not because we were, and they basically, they were disappointed when I said, I'm feeling my vocation is now to go to part-time. Their attitude was, well, half of Leslie's better than none. It was not, accusatory, but they sort of said, well, we'll take what we can get. We love you, you love us, and maybe, and let's do this new thing. And certainly the bottom line was so much better, which speaks to the second point. The bottom line was better because my salary and benefits were cut substantially, but it also meant for them, when they stopped worrying about their bottom line, they gave more. The sessions giving almost quadrupled. The congregational giving went up because they weren't giving to just keep the doors open. Their whole reason for giving shifted. Now that we had, you know, the heat on and the lights on and the refrigerators for the food pantry running. We weren't worried about paying our basic operating expenses. The money was more joyfully given toward, because it was going toward more mission projects. So that was a side effect that I didn't see coming, for sure. You know, I'd heard it said, you know, great investment, great reward, you know, big investment, big reward. And that turned out to be so true. But you can't see that from this side of it. You can only see it from the other side.
So our foundation rep, Ellie Johns Kelly, would be applauding you, and she probably is hearing you over the wires somewhere and really jumping up and down with that. That's a great awareness, and we probably need to think about how we can help interpret that a little more. But we were moving, thank you, Aaron and folks, to talking about the judicatories a little bit. And Maureen has posted, you know, what is the role? Let's get down and dirty. What is the role of presbyteries or synod to be in conversation, with seminaries regarding bivocational realities? And Maureen, if I hope it's okay if we expand that a little bit, because there may be some other comments to come out. In general, what kind of role might judicatory have? But what's your experience in Hudson River about the role of the presbyteries and synod to be maybe pushing some of these new realities? And maybe Rhonda knows some of that as well from her past experience. Have you seen it anywhere? Have you seen us taking an active role from presbyteries to seminaries?
I haven't seen it. But, you know, at presbytery, I mean, seminary is such a little bubble, you know. I went into seminary, it was all consuming, you know, and then I kind of like woke up after I graduated. I was like, oh, what just happened? It was 3 years of my life. It was incredible and wonderful and amazing. And then I was like, boop, it's in a whole new place. So I'm sure, I don't know, at least the seminary I went to was sort of like its own little world. And I'm not sure I'm sure they're still catching up too, anyway.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, you know, I think when you originally said that the presbyteries give lip service to bivocational ministry, I agree with that. I think we encourage bivocational ministry, but we seem to be at a loss to figure out how to help make that happen. And you know, maybe other people have ideas, but it's hard to, you know, it really is up to the pastor to find their own other work.
And I found that COM can be particularly helpful in congregations in mandating that congregations pay for pension and benefits in a part-time call. A lot of times they want to save money by just doing salary. And I think every part-time call needs the pension, at least that portion of pension and benefits and medical paid in, and COM can be a great deal of help in enforcing that.
Yeah, that is one thing that presbyteries can do.
Yeah.
Ed Freeborn, if I may. I was in a conversation with 2 seminary professors yesterday, and I think that we are in a unique time of opportunity in that seminarians, they reflected with me, are very concerned about their employment in this time of pandemic, and also that they're finding some of the difficulties of requirements challenging, particularly clinical pastoral education. One of the options that we would have as a synod would be to provide possible placements for an internship, and we are exploring that with Northumberland and Lackawanna presbyteries. And as part of that program, provide parish-based clinical pastoral education satisfying one of the requirements many presbyteries have for ordination. And then also introduce them to the possibility of bivocational ministry. And I think that would be worth considering and exploring among our presbytery COMs. Thank you.
Thank you. Agreed.
Hey, this is Cheryl Galen from Carlisle. I'm also thinking that our committees on preparation for ministry probably have a critical role in bridging this gap between
the presbytery and the seminary, and wondering if part of CPM's work now is to help those under care to consider vocational questions, both in terms of where their ministry setting will be, but also whether there's a supplemental vocation that will fulfill their gifts and expression of vocation in the world, but also contribute to their financial needs.
This is Joy Kaufman. About 14 years ago, a 3-year project was started. It was the denomination had found a grant, and it was to intentionally bring together 3 times a year for an overnight kind of retreat, 10 local pastors, 4 judicatory execs, and 4 professors from seminaries. And there were several of these clusters started around the country. The event that we're attending right this second was one of the ideas that came out of that cluster closest to where we are geographically. I believe it would take some group, perhaps like EP Forum and the stated clerks of our synod, to simply approach the seminaries that we see within the bounds of our synod as pastor feeder seminaries to express what we believe the congregations really need right now. I think if someone raises the issue of the kinds of congregations we actually have with the seminaries as systems, we can begin to have some positive effect on the way that people are trained. Right now, I have the impression that professors and administrators are providing what they know how to provide. I think even the most modest positive push might help those good folks to clarify their thinking and begin to adapt what kind of training they're providing for pastoral candidates.
Thank you. Thank you. Wayne,
This
you
is
have,
Wayne Yost. One of the ideas I've tried to push for many years is for presbyteries to say, we will not ordain a person to pastoral ministry unless they have a second set of saleable skills by which to earn a living. If the presbyteries do that and make that requirement, then the seminaries are going to have to come around and help us fill that in.
yeah, that's a tall order, but I think it's moving to a necessary one. There's a question from Caroline Vickery. Do you want to speak to that, Caroline? You had a question in the chat.
Sure. My question was, how would you help a congregation distinguish or discern whether a commissioned ruling elder or a part-time pastor, in that sense, an installed or a how would you help them distinguish which they're called to have, and what would be the difference? How would you describe, or what would be the?
Well, I have a friend who's a commissioned ruling elder, commissioned teaching elder, Marjorie. You know, Rhonda, you know Marjorie, and Marjorie, yeah. And she's serving part-time in a church up here, but she also needs benefits and medical. Her husband has medical because so that the church kind of saved on that. I think the difference in those is the benefits package, and what the church can afford it. And I really am resisting that CPEs and are just cheap pastors, and you don't have to pay them benefits. I really we demand a lot from our CPEs, and we want them to be skilled and equipped, and then to say that, oh well, you know you're just a sort of a pastor choice B because we can't get it installed is not fair to them. So I'm not sure that I would be hesitant in saying that the discernment between those two things should come down to packages and benefits. It often does, and that's a problem. I think that's a problem.
Leslie, I think what we find in this area, though, a little bit, this is Sue again, is that we have many CPs who are also working. So they are coming at from bivocational, or many of them are retired as well. So they're coming from different places. I also could imagine from the congregational side of things, as we've talked about this around our leadership tables, there are some congregations that are probably going to do, I'm going to say same old, but I don't want to mean that in a negative way. They're going to move through the church year. They have their missions. They're not necessarily going to be ones that are reaching towards some missional change. So the kind of skill base and vision that they might need might be different than somebody else. I mean, I know Margie, she comes to her CP role with incredible gifts and skills for ministry, right? And a lot of education. We have CPs that come from a deep-rooted, wonderful, abiding faith, and maybe not as much education. And so the choice, and Caroline, if all things are even and we really have choices to make with the people we might put in place, who would be put in place, there might be some distinguished. Maybe it's about persons, though, more than about their letters before their name. It might be that this person, given life experience and skills, would be better suited in this kind of a situation and this one in another. I love a church moving to, the idea of a church moving to part-time, where opening up more mission and ministry possibilities because of the money changes. I love where that breeds new vision and new energy. Your telling of that is just awesome. That's awesome. And would that we could maximize that kind of opportunity. We might breathe some new life when in fact the statistics might tell us it's going the other way because we're moving from full-time to part-time. That's wonderful.
And I do think that there are lots of congregations that have their ministry in hand and know what they want and don't want to do anything more. And I think that there's something to be said about being a steady presence.
It occurs to me, and there's some good notes in the chat about some of the seminary stuff, but it occurs to me that if you have a last pastor, likely last full-time pastor in place, and you can see that coming, as this is the presbytery role, you can see that coming, it might give you some time to scan the horizon to raise up some potential leadership or leadership teams for a congregation, as opposed to, okay, the pastor's leaving retirement dinner, we start to meet over this now, and oh, right, we're not going to full-time again. There's that possibility to have a longer term vision around our congregations if we can engage that potentially last full-time pastor in some significant work around the identity of the congregation moving forward. But I'm not sure any of us embrace that yet, which is why when I put out the word for this, there was one response across, I think I put it out on AMCL, of intentional move from full-time to part-time in leadership. I'm not sure that we've always looked ahead far enough to utilize the role that you filled, whether or not that person moves to part-time, right? It's to do the congregational work.
Thank you. I also, Maureen had a comment about the goal of, requiring medical pension for part-time pastors, but there are contexts, and says there are contexts where this requirement simply means more churches without pastoral leadership, just a frustrating reality. Maureen, do you want to speak more about that? Are you here?
Yes.
I can, or Ed Thompson can, or others. This is kind of what Joy was saying, some of the realities of being in Appalachia, being in a presbytery where our median church size is maybe down to 26, Ed's the statistician between the two of us, and just the reality of every time you look at trying to balance the support of pastors, which is a very big responsibility, with the requirements and where churches are, just that reality. I mean, we have 123 churches right now, and you know, the median size is 26. That's a lot of churches. And when you say you have to do this for a part-time pastor and a commissioned pastor, most of them, you know, many of them just, that's the reality. It's just a frustrating reality because I completely agree with supporting professionals for the work they do. And yet the reality is we don't have the ability to have endless money. So maybe somebody else will make more sense.
Well, I can only, so my vocation, my passion is the well-being of pastors. And I remember having a conversation with my former GP, Susan Andrews, who we were both on, and we were in an administrative commission together. And I remember having this conversation about, you know, when it comes to the church needs and the pastoral needs, you know, and I said, you know, I've operated for such a long time, and I'm a counselor, and I worked in recovery and families and family systems, and I said, you know, even if the pastor has gone bonkers, you know, even if the pastor has gone south in a situation and been a cause of disharmony in the church, or, you know, if that pastor is willing to do their own work, if it comes down to choosing the who gets the benefit of the doubt, the congregation or the pastor, I said, I will go with the pastor because I know the demands of the job and I know what that is. And she said, and I'll always pick the congregation. And I do understand this tension. And I also, from a personal standpoint, I want pastors to thrive. And yes, there will be churches without leadership, and pastors need to live. It's not, you know, for me, when it comes down to, well, you can either get paid or we can have a church pulpit filled. At least I've done so much service without money in my life. And I have, you know, one of my mistakes was almost bankrupting myself for this congregation. And I'm not willing to either do that or to encourage anybody else to do that anymore. So I think that's a reality. That's my personal take, but I welcome comments around that too.
Thank you. It wasn't meant to you personally. It just the reality of what presbyteries are dealing with.
Yep.
I'm married to a pastor. I'm all for us eating and other things in addition to whatever. Anyway, but
right. And I think sometimes saying, you know, like, oh, this church is without pastoral leadership. That church is without pastoral leadership. It's
yeah. We're just coming from different places, because for me it means I'm closing 3 or 4 churches a year because that's what no pastoral leadership leads to. That's a really grief-stricken reality.
Yeah, I have had churches that closed and became part of other congregations and had that be a really fruitful time as well. But that's a lot of work too to get to that place too. Well, you know all that. You've been through it all. So
some of it depends on how the presbytery is able to support that congregation, right? And
right.
How there might be a coach or a mentor to walk along. See Don Wallach's question to everybody at the end here. He's asking what role might commissioned ruling elders play in helping churches transition? Have folks had experience with that? Has anybody utilized commissioned pastors in almost an intentional interim kind of a function? Joy,
we have in one setting, and the commissioned lay pastor was extraordinarily gifted. The congregation approached that ministry with the mindset that they needed to pay that pastor full presbytery minimum plus the board of pensions and retirement, although he wasn't in the traditional pastor's plan, participation plan with the board of pensions. But as a presbytery, given the size of the congregation and their ability, we required of them comparable benefits. They did that joyfully, and the long-term net effect was that the next time they were looking for pastoral leadership, they went back to full-time called and installed PCUSA seminary trained leadership. I find a lot of the circumstances are very contextual. If, as a presbytery, we encourage the sessions of the church not to focus on the budget first, but to look for opportunities in ministry, it puts the entire conversation in an entirely different place. And they are much more likely to come up with a solution. For instance, another of our congregations decided that they wanted to go from full-time to half-time pastoral ministry using a seminary trained person, so that instead of always stretching to struggle to pay the pastor, and that became the driver in the entire church budget, they wanted to use those half-time monies for mission in their area and beyond. And when they started thinking about it that way, then what they requested of the presbytery was, could we share a half-time position that's Presbyterian with a half-time position down the block with the Evangelical Lutheran congregation to create a full-time call? So we now have a pastor. At the age of 70, she entered her first call. Her primary emphasis in ministry is on the arts. But here are these two congregations surrounded by cornfields with a delightful new pastor who is serving ecumenically. Her primary call is Presbyterian because she's Presbyterian, but the ecumenical agreement of mutual understanding allows her to serve equally with the Lutheran church right down the road. So how we frame the questions as a presbytery, as Committee on Ministry coming to partner with sessions, we have found makes a huge positive difference.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree. And it also gets to Maureen's point of the frustrating reality. If there's an identity shift as well in the congregation, if the congregation thinks of itself in terms of functioning or not functioning, whether they have a pastor or not, who are they? I mean, who are they without pastoral leadership? Are they maybe, you know, and so sometimes asking people to identify themselves without the pastor or who they would be without a person in place is a huge shift in identity in terms of mission and moving forward as well. Yeah, Rhonda.
I think we have to also be honest with churches in the decision they're making. If they say they can't afford a pastor, they're choosing their building over having a pastor. And they're idolizing their building, saying we can't be the church without a building, but if we can't afford a pastor, oh well. And, you know, I think we just have to call them on that and say, we don't necessarily think you're making the right decision.
Yeah. And all of it, of course, you know, is out of love. All of it is out of the love for the history and the foundation and the people we have been in those places. And it's a real challenge. I mean, I remember sort of complaining to a colleague when I was in Carlisle Presbytery saying, I don't know. And she just responded with, Jesus said, birds have their nests and foxes their holes, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And I was like, oh, thanks a lot, you know. But I think we've asked that of pastors for years and years, and wondering if it's time to ask that of congregations too, to be a little more daring and fluid and flexible in how they identify themselves, not as brick and mortar, but as the body of Christ, however that body of Christ changes and shifts over time.
The caveat to be not completely 180 is, though, when that building is used for community ministry in many ways, when there's Meals on Wheels, when there's daycare, when there's it all needs to come into play when there's a variety of things. But that also may expose the need for a bigger vision about how the needs of that building might get supported and funded.
Well, and I think in COVID-19, we have so many churches have been not using their buildings. They have been worshiping outside of their buildings. And
right.
So I'm hoping that helps people see that maybe the building is not as important as we thought.
Yeah.
But this is Carla Campbell from Pittsburgh. Just to interject, a lot of these buildings, it's not like there's an offer waiting and they can just jettison the building and take their big check and go. We find when we close these churches, some of them can take years to even give away. So it's not like you can say to congregations, make a bold choice, jettison the building. That has its own implications.
Yes, there was a congregation up here in New York that had an organ and woodwork. I mean, just a huge, and it took a long time for other people to move in, and then for that place. I mean, it did take years. It took years for that transition. That is not an easy task at all.
This is Nancy from Huntington Presbytery. I also am from the Milesburg Presbyterian Church, and we don't want to use the word yoked, but we are sharing a pastor between Milesburg and Bellefonte, making a full-time position. And it's a 2-year designated. One of the things I would caution, and I go back to some of the things that Rhonda said, I would caution when we try this, that the churches be evenly yoked. And that is a problem that we're going to be facing shortly. We have one congregation who is so sentimentally tied to their building that they can't see that it's falling down around them. And so when it's coming time now at the end of 2020 to decide what to do, where we'll be at the end of our 2-year designated, the churches are not evenly divided here. We're not evenly seeing the way forward. So that's a cautionary tale, and I ask you to look at that.
We're past the witching hour, gang, and I know there's folks that are going to be coming on at 11 o'clock, and so we want to wind down and give Leslie last chance to make some comments. But while she's doing that, this is your chance to just throw some stuff up in the chat that you might want us to remember and look ahead with. And I feel like in some ways where the energy of the conversation is just getting moving. There's so many aspects of this. Our intention was, I'll tell you where this came from, in a conversation with Northumberland, Lehigh, and Lackawanna, we're having some conversations about possible identity and future. This whole idea of how can we're short-handed in a lot of our work. How can we help the last pastor that's going to be full-time, possibly be an asset to the work of the presbytery? How do we do that? And lo and behold, Leslie's rose to the top of the possibility of somebody who had done this work in a very special and unique way, which speaks to how contextual it may be. So send some notes to us about this whole conversation, because it is an important one, whether we're talking about judicatory eyeballs, judicatory work, pastor training. There's been some interesting stuff coming up that we haven't even touched. Jennifer Baer from Lackawanna, who is right now providing one-room schoolhouse at her house while she's listening, this is why she hasn't spoken, said that Lackawanna is just beginning to train CPs for some of this kind of work, which is exciting, and we knew that they had been hoping to. We're going to send you out, hopefully momentarily, all things working together for good, an evaluation where you'll be able to throw in some more notes and some future possibilities. Some of you look like you have had your caffeine already, and some of you look like you haven't finished yours yet. So I hope that you will get yourselves caffeinated, continue with some of what's going on for the rest of the day and tomorrow with this gathering of COM-CPM. If you want to sign up for something else you haven't, go ahead and go back to the registration page and do that. We'll try to pick up. They'll be functioning this way. We are thrilled that you have stepped in to this way of working, and that you all were the guinea pigs in a big way, and that I screwed up, and that Mike and I have shown you what our teamwork looks like, because he covered my hind end in a big way this morning when I messed up the time of this opening. I'm going to ask Leslie if you would close us out and pray us into our what next, and say a big, big thank you to you.
Yes, my pleasure. It's great to be with you. And just one final comment. Remember that this is about discernment. And as my spiritual director has often reminded me, discernment, we make the crucial journey from our heads to our hearts, the crucial 12-inch journey. And that if you know what's happening, if you already know the result you want, then it's not discernment, right? So that discernment opens up right? If we already knew what we wanted to do, it wouldn't be discernment. So this process is a process of unknowing and moving in with an open mind and heart. And so I'm going to close us in a prayer, which is also a song, and I'll play it for you. It's called "You, Lord, Are in This Place" by Keith Duke. And the words are, "You, Lord, are in this place. Your presence fills it. Your presence is peace. You, Lord, are in our minds. Your presence fills it. Your presence is peace. You, Lord, are in our lives. Your presence fills it. Your presence is peace." So we'll close with that.